Okay, good morning, church. And today we are continuing our study through 1 Samuel, and we're looking at chapter 14 today, which is a story about God's providential action, and in that he's helping Israel, or he's causing Israel to transition, and we'll talk about that, what that looks like in a second. But within God's providential action, we see two characters, mainly Jonathan, the son of King Saul, and King Saul himself, and how they are kind of acting within this context of God doing what he does with the nation of Israel and the conflicts that they are facing. And so one of these characters, speaking of Jonathan and his father King Saul, one of these characters really demonstrates, I'm going to just refer to it as a simple faith. It's a simple believing faith. And the other one demonstrates a real commitment to religion. And hopefully as we go through the text today, you'll be able to see the difference. But before we get there, I want to go to a question right off the bat here, and I want you to take a few minutes and discuss, how does your faith in God shape and motivate your everyday life? Here, when we come to this chapter at this point, as Tyler laid out last week, at this point, the state of Israel is really vulnerable. In the previous chapter, we saw them under attack, unarmed, hiding out, and this story today is the story of the fortunes of a nation being reversed by what looks like a simple act of faith and an act of honoring God. And then God, in turn, honoring that faith and intervening in the circumstances. As we kind of zoom the camera back on this story, though, what we see is God acting, and we see Jonathan, where we start this story, just living his life and just having this simple belief that God is who he says he is. So let's get to the text. One day, Jonathan, son of Saul, said to his young armor-bearer, "Come, let's go over to the Philistine outpost on the other side." But he did not tell his father. Saul was staying on the outskirts of Gibeah under a pomegranate tree in Migron. With him were about 600 men, among whom was Ahijah, who was wearing an ephod. He was a son of Ichabod's brother Ahitub, son of Phinehas, the son of Eli, the Lord's priest in Shiloh. No one was aware that Jonathan had left. On each side of the pass that Jonathan intended to cross to reach the Philistine outpost was a cliff. One was called Bozez and the other Seneh. One cliff stood to the north toward Michmash, and the other to the south toward Geba. Jonathan said to his young armor-bearer, "Come, let's go over to the outpost of those uncircumcised men. Perhaps the Lord will act in our behalf. Nothing can hinder the Lord from saving, whether by many or by few." "Do all that you have in mind," his armor-bearer said. "Go ahead, I am with you, heart and soul." And Jonathan said, "Come on then. We will cross over toward them and let them see us. If they say to us, 'Wait there until we come to you,' we will stay where we are and not go up to them. But if they say, 'Come up to us,' we will climb up, because that will be our sign that the Lord has given them into our hands." So both of them showed themselves to the Philistine outpost. "Look," said the Philistines, "the Hebrews are crawling out of their holes they were hiding in." The men of the outpost shouted to Jonathan and his armor-bearer, "Come up to us, and will teach you a lesson." So Jonathan said to his armor-bearer, "Climb up after me. The Lord has given them into the hand of Israel." Jonathan climbed up, using his hands and feet, with his armor-bearer right behind him. The Philistines fell before Jonathan, and his armor-bearer followed and killed behind him. In that first attack, Jonathan and his armor-bearer killed some 20 men in an area of about half an acre. So here we see this demonstration of Jonathan's faith. And I find it interesting when we look at verse 6, that Jonathan, he knows what God can do. His statement is, "Nothing can hinder the Lord from saving, whether by many or by few." He knows what God can do, but does he necessarily know what God will do? Well, the first part of that sentence is interesting because he said, "Perhaps the Lord will act in our behalf." Right? So he doesn't necessarily know exactly what the Lord will do, but he knows what the Lord can do. He understands the sovereignty and the power and the ultimate power of God. Based on his understanding of God, he makes a decision to just him and his armor bearer to then follow through on their faith. It's interesting that Jonathan sets a criteria, and sometimes you need to have a way to make decisions, and that's what Jonathan does here. He says, if they call us up, let's go up. That's God's sign. And then he follows through on that. And so Jonathan establishes a criteria, and then he acts on what he knows to be true of God, and that nothing can hinder the Lord from saving. And so he and his armor bearer, they take on, it turns out, about 20 men in a limited area, and they are victorious. And so there we have this demonstration of Jonathan just acting on what he knows to be true of God, and he's living his life in a way that God is shaping. His faith is shaping kind of how he walks through life and how he makes decisions. Let's move on now to verse 15, which is critical. Verse 15 says, "Then panic struck the whole army, those in the camp and field, and those in the outposts and raiding parties, and the ground shook." And here's the key sentence, it was a panic sent by God. So you got to remember, Israel is in this place of being unarmed, and they're fearful, they're hiding, except for Jonathan and the armor bearer, and they act on what they know to be true of God. And then we see the sovereignty of God come into play in this story, where God, much like he did in the days of Gideon back in the Judges, he sends a panic amongst the enemy army, amongst the Philistines. And so now we see coming into place the transition of Israel from unarmed and hiding to now moving into being a powerful force. And so this transition of Israel from unarmed and hiding from their enemy is brought about by God sending panic into the Philistines. Verse 16. Saul's lookouts at Gibeah and Benjamin saw the army melting away in all directions. Then Saul said to the men who were with him, "Muster the forces and see who has left us." When they did it, it was Jonathan and his armor-bearer who were not there. Saul said to Ahijah, "Bring the ark of God." At that time it was with the Israelites. And while Saul was talking to the priests, the tumult in the Philistine camp increased more and more. So Saul said to the priest, "Withdraw your hand." Then Saul and his men assembled and went to battle. They found the Philistines in total confusion, striking each other with their swords. Those Hebrews who had previously been with the Philistines and had gone up with them to their camp went over to the Israelites who were with Saul and Jonathan. And when all the Israelites who had hidden in the hill country of Ephraim heard that the Philistines were on the run, they joined the battle in hot pursuit. So on that day the Lord saved Israel and the battle moved on beyond Beth Aven. So what we see here is when God sends this panic and the Philistines start turning on each other, well, you can see what's going to happen. The Israelites are going to pounce on that, and they're going to become armed because they'll take the weapons of the Philistines. So the army is energized and brought together by God's intervention. So when God acts and they see what's going on, they're all of a sudden encouraged, energized, and off they go. And Jonathan's act of faith initially resulted in a series of events caused by God that completely reversed the fortunes of the Israelites and the Philistines. Now we get to verse 24, and we'll read it, and you'll see how we go from Jonathan and Jonathan's faith, and then the next piece is about God's sovereignty, and now we have King Saul, the next character, major character in this piece, and how King Saul, how should we say it? He turns out to be quite reactive to what's going on, and we're going to see that he's very religious in the way he responds to the circumstances. So verse 24. Now the Israelites were in distress that day because Saul had bound the people under an oath, saying, Cursed be anyone who eats food before evening comes, before I have avenged myself on my enemies. So none of the troops tasted food. The entire army entered the woods, and there was honey on the ground. And when they went into the woods, they saw the honey oozing out, yet no one put his hand to his mouth because they feared the oath. But Jonathan had not heard that his father had bound the people with the oath. So he reached out the end of the staff that was in his hand and dipped it into the honeycomb. He raised his hand to his mouth, and his eyes brightened. Then one of the soldiers told him, Your father bound the army under a strict oath, saying, Cursed be anyone who eats food today, and that is why the men are faint. And Jonathan said, My father has made trouble for the country. See how my eyes brightened when I tasted a little of this honey? How much better would it have been if the men had eaten today some of the plunder they took from their enemies? Would not the slaughter of the Philistines have been even greater? So here we have this oath that Saul binds his army to. And I'm going to call it a foolish oath. I want to just start with Jonathan's evaluation of the oath. What does Jonathan say? My father has made trouble for this country. He thinks about this oath. That was a dumb thing to do, is basically what he's saying. So Saul's oath is a foolish oath. Well, what makes it foolish? Well, I can identify two things in this text that make this a foolish oath. Number one, King Saul's oath was self-centered. What did he say? The oath is cursed is anyone who eats food before evening comes, before I have avenged myself on my enemies. What did this oath have to do with? Apparently it didn't have anything to do with God. It had to do with King Saul. And then it turns out not only was it very self-centered, but it was also not very sensible. It didn't make any sense. And we see this in the condition of the men. Here they are going up against an enemy that's in mass confusion, that God has stirred panic amongst. And they're faint. They're tired. And Jonathan goes, how dumb is this? If we had just eaten a little of the plunder, then we could be more efficient. We could get this job done. So it was a foolish oath. Verse 31. That day after the Israelites had struck down the Philistines from Michmash to Aijalon, they were exhausted. They pounced on the plunder and, taking sheep, cattle, and calves, they butchered them on the ground and ate them, together with the blood. Then someone said to Saul, Look, the men are sinning against the Lord by eating meat that has blood in it. You have broken faith, he said. Roll a large stone over here at once. Then he said, Go out among the men and tell them, Each of you bring me your cattle and sheep and slaughter them here, and eat them. Do not sin against the Lord by eating meat with blood still in it. So everyone brought his ox that night and slaughtered it there. Then Saul built an altar to the Lord. It was the first time he had done this. So now we see Saul reacting to this problem that basically he caused, in a sense. He contributed a lot to it because of this oath. And so at the end of the day, when the men turn their attention to the plunder, I mean, they're super hungry, so they just dive in and they just start eating. And they're not paying attention to the laws of Israel and to God's way of doing things. So at least Saul has the ability to recognize that they're not doing this properly, and so he at least tries to address the issue. So here we have the army not following Jewish law, and they just dove right in, started eating, blood and all, which they weren't supposed to. And Saul recognizes this issue and he saw that this was a sin before the Lord. And so he applied a corrective. Once he applied a correction and built an altar, and so they kind of, in a way, addressed the problem. And then what? Then he was ready to continue to pursue the Philistines. So what was Saul's motivation in doing the religious thing? And it almost feels like, well, okay, we got a problem here. Let's apply a ritual. We'll take care of that. Now let's get on with life. And in verse 36, that's what happens. Saul said, "Let us go down and pursue the Philistines by night, and plunder them till dawn, and let us not leave one of them alive." And the men said to him, "Do whatever seems best to you," they replied. But a priest said, "Let us inquire of God here." So Saul asked God, "Shall I go down and pursue the Philistines? Will you give them into Israel's hand?" But God did not answer him that day. Saul therefore said, "Come here, all of you who are leaders of the army, and let us find out what sin has been committed today. As surely as the Lord who rescues Israel lives, even if the guilt lies with my son Jonathan, he must die." But not one of them said a word. Saul then said to all the Israelites, "You stand over there, I and Jonathan will stand over here." "Do what seems best to you," they replied. Then Saul prayed to the Lord, the God of Israel, "Why have you not answered your servant today? If the fault is in me or my son Jonathan, respond with Urim, but if the men of Israel are at fault, respond with Thummim." Jonathan and Saul were taken by lot, and the men were cleared. Saul said, "Cast the lot between me and Jonathan my son," and Jonathan was taken. So here we have more problems caused by this oath. Jonathan didn't know about the oath, and he had disobeyed the oath. And now this is the incident where they find out who did not observe the oath. And it's really the pattern here is more of Saul's religious piety, because now he is obligated to follow through on this oath that he took, this ritual that he put in place, this kind of superstition that he followed. Now he feels obligated to follow through on that. And they figure out who the problem was by casting lots, basically, the Urim and the Thummim, that's what that's referring to, that Jonathan violated the oath out of ignorance. So let's look at verse 43 and 44. Then Saul said to Jonathan, "Tell me what you have done." So Jonathan told him, "I have tasted a little honey with the end of my staff, and now I must die." And here's Saul's response. Saul said, "May God deal with me, be it ever so severely, if you do not die, Jonathan." So here we have Saul ready to follow through with Jonathan's death because of his foolish oath. At no time do we get the sense that Jonathan even regrets his actions. He ate the honey, he felt better, he thought the oath was dumb, and now he said, "Well, I'm the guy that did this, so now I must die." There's another account in Scripture of a father who is instructed to sacrifice their son, and that is the story of Abraham and Isaac. The interesting thing is that Abraham is held up as a great example of faith and righteousness. for being willing to sacrifice Isaac as God had instructed him, while Saul is seen as being foolish, even though Abraham and Saul are willing to carry out the same act. So what is the difference between the two? What's the difference between Abraham, who's held up as an example of faith and righteousness, and Saul, who is seen as being foolish? Now, it might seem really obvious, the answer, but I think it's worth exploring and putting some definition to this so that we have an understanding of the difference between faith in God and just religious action. So I want you to go to a discussion, a table talk. What are the similarities and differences between this story of Saul, and the story of Abraham being told by God to sacrifice his son Isaac? And why do we see Abraham as a great example of faith and Saul as being foolish? I'm going to guess that where you arrived in your thoughts and your discussion is something like this. Faith has everything to do with what motivates an act, and has less to do with the act itself. This illustrates what is wrong with practicing religious ritual. The rituals themselves do not achieve anything. It is the heart, trust, and understanding and following through with obedience that is meaningful. So we have the difference between faith and just religious action. How does this go? Well, let's go to verse 45. But the men said to Saul, "Should Jonathan die, he who has brought about this great deliverance in Israel? Never, as surely as the Lord lives, not a hair of his head will fall to the ground, for he did this today with God's help." So the men rescued Jonathan, and he was not put to death. So here we see that in the light of everything, the men, the army, they defy Saul, and they rescue Jonathan. And it's interesting that there's no record of Saul even resisting this. So because of his foolishness, Saul's leadership takes a hit. In that, Jonathan is seen as the one who acted with God's help when he and his armor bearer, through an act of faith and through an act of relying on God, took on 20 Philistines, which seemed to be the first domino to fall in this series of events. And so we have Jonathan, who is seen as the one who acted with God's help, and Saul looks like he can't really figure out what to do. Saul is always reacting to circumstances rather than proactively setting the tone. He's trying to just react to what's going on with some kind of a religious action rather than having faith and making decisions based on his faith. Jonathan was the one who initiated this transition from being unarmed and hiding out to routing the Philistines and taking the plunder. So Saul's character here is really taking a hit. Verse 46. Now we're going to recover some of Saul here, but I'll make a comment on that. Verse 46, then Saul stopped pursuing the Philistines, and they withdrew to their own land. The upshot is because of these decisions, they couldn't finish the battle. So that's where that battle ends. So in the wake of this, however, verse 47, after Saul had assumed rule over Israel, he fought against their enemies on every side, Moab, the Ammonites, Edom, the kings of Zobah, and the Philistines. And wherever he turned, he inflicted punishment on them. He fought valiantly and defeated the Amalekites, delivering Israel from the hands of those who had plundered them. When I read that, it's talking about some of Saul's victories and some successes. My question is this anticipating the later comparisons with David's military accomplishments? As we will come across later in the book, the people sing things like David has killed his 10,000s and Saul his thousands, or it might be the other way around. But we're setting up, here's Saul's level of accomplishment. Is it just setting us up for the introduction of David? Saul's sons, verse 49, Saul's sons were Jonathan, Ishvi, and Malchishua. The name of his older daughter was Merab, and that of the younger was Michal. So his wife's name was Ahinoam, daughter of Ahimaaz. The name of the commander of Saul's army was Abner, son of Ner, and Ner was Saul's uncle. Saul's father Kish and Abner's father Ner were sons of Abiel. In all the days of Saul, there was bitter war with the Philistines, and whenever Saul saw a mighty or a brave man, he took him into his service. And again, verse 52 is anticipating David, King David. So, in summary, what do we say about this text, this story? Well, I want to compare Jonathan's mindset with Saul's mindset. Jonathan's mindset is, nothing can hinder the Lord from saving, whether by many or few. And another thing about his mindset is in his evaluation of his father's oath, he goes, how much better it would have been if the men had eaten today. And what we see in Jonathan is basically a trusting mindset. He puts his trust in God. Nothing can hinder the Lord. And so we have a real, just what I look at and just call a simple faith. Not that it's simple in being silly or anything, but it's just Jonathan just seeing things clearly. He doesn't complicate it. Whereas Saul's mindset, well, here it is. Saul had bound the people under an oath, saying, cursed be anyone who eats food before evening comes, before I have avenged myself. Well, that speaks for itself. And then another thing that reveals his mindset, Saul said, let us go down and pursue the Philistines by night and plunder them till dawn, and let us not leave one of them alive. And then the army says, do whatever seems best, but the priest said, let us inquire of God here. And so here's Saul just, pushing ahead. But fortunately for him, the priest is saying, wait a minute, we need to inquire of God. And that's not one of Saul's strengths is stopping. And it's interesting that one of the things that we're going to see in David's life later is there's a phrase that happens every so often in the David narrative, and it's basically David inquired of the Lord, and that phrase will come up from time to time, whereas we don't really associate that with King Saul. At this point, Saul in his mindset seems willing to try to appease God, but not really inquire of God. And that is a religious mindset, always trying to do the ritual or do the thing that will kind of just keep God off your back, a religious mindset. Whereas, contrast that with Jonathan, who goes, there's nothing that can stop God, so let's move forward in that, right? Very different. Jonathan's actions are based on what he knows God can do. He trusts God. Saul's actions seem to be based on what he doesn't want God to do, and he tries to appease God while being obsessed with his own agenda. So here's our final table talk, and it is this. How do you get to a place in life where your faith in God allows you to make choices and act courageously, as opposed to acting to try to appease God and keeping him off your back? When you've talked about this, then take some time to pray for one another, and we'll see you next week.